Welcome. My name is David Smith, and I'm president of the Forage Center for Peacebuilding and Humanitarian Education. And thank you for joining us. The Forage Center focuses on advancing humanitarian and peacebuilding education in the United States, and we work very closely with education, higher education, particularly graduate students, undergraduate students. And we work with students and young professionals who are trying to advance their careers. So one of the things that we developed several years ago was a series called the Forage Center Conversations, where periodically we will interview, talk with a professional in the field, and find out more about what the professional is doing. And I'm actually with the Director of Education, Jess Bonham-White. I'll turn it back over to her so she can introduce our guest, and then we'll follow up for some questions. But I'm so glad you've joined us today.
Great. As David just said, my name is Jess Bonham-White. I'm the Director of Education and Training at the Forage Center, and I'm very happy to be here. And I'm very happy to be part of our Forage Center Conversations series. I am the Director of Education and Training at the Forage Center. I'm also a faculty member at Stockton University, and I teach humanitarian assistance, emergency management, and criminal justice. So we'll be talking a bit about how to prepare ourselves for careers in an interdisciplinary humanitarian field. So I'm very excited to have our guest today. I'm going to read a rather lengthy bio because I think all of our viewers will be very impressed. And I think it will really set up our conversation about humanitarian assistance and peace education and peace building as an interdisciplinary career, one that there's a lot of ways of getting into it, a lot of ways of preparing for it. And certainly our guest is an individual who can say a lot about that. So I want to introduce Katie Zanoni. She holds an EDD in International and Multicultural Education from the University of San Francisco from 2018. Her dissertation, which was Peace Education in Kenya, tracing a discourse in action from the national to the local level, presents a vertical case study to examine the manifestation of parallel peace education initiatives within the formal education sector at the national and the local levels. Her scholarship and practice explores transformative approaches to peace building, human rights, and social justice in education in diverse contexts. She has 20 years of experience in program design and management in the education and the not-for-profit sector, working within organizations like the International Rescue Committee and the Joan B. Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice. As an instructional designer, she's developed a curriculum as a Peace Corps volunteer in Thailand, a Stanford Human Rights Education Initiative fellow, and as the co-founder of the Education for Transformation for programs in Kenya and Myanmar. After Katie obtained her master's degree in peace and justice studies at the University of San Diego in 2006, she co-founded and lectured in the first peace studies associate degree program at San Diego City College and has developed courses on conflict resolution and sustainability for the college. Yay. Her research interests include a critical peace education, a gender, a transformative human rights education, women leaders in peace building, yay again, and conflict transformation through educational policy. She employs a variety of research methodologies, including a narrative inquiry, mixed methods analysis, surveys, participant observation, grounded theory, and a vertical case study design. And as a mother scholar, she maintains a critical lens to examine the issues of power, gender, race, and culture within her communities of practice to build trust and reciprocity. I'm so excited. Currently, she is working as the Learning and Evidence Senior Officer at the International Rescue Committee. So I'm super excited because your background is quite impressive and hits many of the vocabulary words that I, as a scholar and as the director here at the Forage Center, get very excited to hear. So before we get into our questions, I also wanted to give David a little bit of a space to discuss his background and particularly his expertise in career building, so all of our viewers can get an idea of what the discussion is going to be about. So David.
I have to start off by saying that Katie and I have known each other for some time. I've been really glad to know the progress of her career. I first got to know Katie, I think, when you were teaching at San Diego City College, when you started the program there, which one of the areas that I've worked a lot with over the years is community colleges and advancing peace building in those sectors. And then I wrote a book about 6 years ago that Katie contributed to on peace careers, peace jobs, which then kind of leads to this career kind of question and area that I work on. You know, I teach at the Carter School at George Mason University, and I run the career seminar there for master's degree students. And we were always trying to figure out where our students should work. And you know, Katie was a master's degree student at the Kroc School at the University of San Diego. So the challenges that are posed to my students, she's experienced. One of the things that I have seen, you know, the field is changing and evolving, but where Katie is today, looking at kind of assessment and evaluation, is something that as a field we've often neglected, and it's often been a criticism of broadly the peace building humanitarian community, that, you know, we say, well, it works, we know it works, but how can we prove it works, right? And this has been a real challenge. So one of the things that with my own students that we've talked about, you know, what does that career look like? I know in our master's degree program we have a course on metrics and monitoring and evaluation. So that I'm really interested in kind of that dimension of it, particularly for master's degree students, and what that field looks like, and the importance of it. So, you know, you are in that field, so you're probably in a better position to say the relevance and why it's really important for our field. So I'll leave it there.
Great. So we'll go ahead and get started. For the viewers, I've basically got 4 questions that we're going to go through, but of course we'll have some time for a discussion afterwards. So I first want to start out with, since this is a field that many get into from a variety of different places, can you describe your interest in humanitarian work and how you got into the field of a general humanitarian work and assistance and, you know, this area?
Sure. So actually, thank you so much, David. It's wonderful to see you and think about and reflect on the path, and just wonderful to meet you, Jess, and see this work. So actually, I would say my start was with the Peace Corps in Thailand. And so I was in the Peace Corps, and my background was environmental science coming out of college. If we think about that in terms of time and how things have changed, hopefully we can find some positive change, but we also see how the narrative around environmental science, for example, has changed based on the needs and the immediacy of what we see today, in terms of climate change. And, you know, at the time I was looking at an old textbook, and when I was in my studies, there were 5 billion people on the earth, and now we're caring for 8 billion. And so if we even think about that, it's times have changed in many ways. But while I was serving in the Peace Corps in Thailand, my focus was environmental science. And in that time, I just really started thinking about how we're caring for one another, and noticing the stark differences between the have and have-nots, and the global north and south, if you will, and realized and really thought deeply around the need to care for one another and to be in the humanitarian field, because the environment is caring for the environment is a rich man's, rich woman's, rich person's issue. And if we're to learn to care for the environment, we also need to learn to care for one another. And so I started to look into the field of peace studies, and that's how I found, the master's program, and then went into my early career with the International Rescue Committee early on, it was August 2001, which then in September, the whole landscape of our geopolitical world changed as we know it. And so then my career kind of launched into the humanitarian field via education, and it takes shape a lot of different ways through the lens, really primarily of peace and human rights and social justice education.
Great. David, I didn't
I'm
want to
sh-
add anything
No,
about
I'm
the
struck by,
passion.
no, I'm struck by so many people start in the Peace Corps. I was not a Peace Corps volunteer, but my son was a Peace Corps volunteer. My son was in the Peace Corps in Namibia, and now he works for the EPA. So this environmental connection, and he wasn't doing environmental work in Namibia, he was teaching mathematics, but now he does environmental work. He works for the EPA. So it's amazing how the Peace Corps seeds so many careers, and people kind of go from there. So I'm glad you were able to follow through and continue in that vein. Yeah.
Mhm.
I think that the as you brought up, the way we're thinking about the environment, even and talking about it within the field, even 5 years ago and even earlier, right? There is a sense of urgency now, and particularly getting students who have that background really thinking about more holistically how the environment really does contextualize everyone's lives, right? And how we contribute to sort of environmental factors, and how it crosses all the other sectors of human life. Where at Stockton University, I'm actually the coordinator of our migration studies program. And of course, what's on our mind is climate migrants, right? And what is that going to mean? Because that's not really a category that's covered by a lot of international law or any kind of legal frameworks. But we know that generally that's going to be a major push factor throughout the world. And do we look at climate migrants differently? And do they experience the experience of displacement and new communities in a different way than, say, other migrants or those who are displaced through war, conflict, disaster, some of these other things? So it's really interesting that that's your background. And I think we're going to see more students like that and more young professionals with that background, which will be good. So next question is to really focus in on monitoring and evaluation. And David spoke about this and sort of how his master's program has a class in this. Can you give us a description? So some of the viewers watching may not know what M&E is, or monitoring and evaluation, or it sounds scary, or what does that mean? So can you give us a description of what M&E looks like in the humanitarian field? And what are the main activities that you do within this broad area of work?
It's going to look different in different spaces. And so, so monitoring and evaluation should largely be coupled with the design of a program or a project. And I really like to frame it, maybe it's because I'm an educator by my training, but I like to frame it as a way of learning. And so we're learning about the impact of different project or programs, and then we're thinking about and reflecting upon what, how to move that impact forward, or how to move away from that project design and try something different. And so, putting that adaptation. So if someone hasn't heard about this, or if you think about this, we can think about this through a program cycle. And so, even thinking back to my time in the Peace Corps as an example, a program cycle is gonna think about it, in a circle where you're preparing to implement a program. So in a preparation for design of a new program, you're going to want to do a needs assessment and do stakeholder analysis. And all of these things are with the community that you're working with the, and making sure there's participatory processes. And then you're going to move those ideas from the needs assessment into the design process, where you're thinking about, what kind of activities are we going to do, and what kind of outcome or objective are we trying to reach with this program design to meet the needs of the community, with the community. And so you go into that phase, and then you go into the implementation phase, right, where you're working with the community, implementing these interventions. And then you're going to move through the implementation phase, depending on your funding, right, depending on what is available in the resources. You might either end and transfer out of that project. And ideally, you're transferring the knowledge, skills, and attitudes, or the resources, or you've built capacity so that the community has what they need and they can move forward. And so ideally you're working yourself out of a job. But if you're not, and there's still needs, then you're going to move into kind of that learning phase where you're learning about what just happened in your project, and you're going to think about how to adapt if you continue that project and make it better. So that's the project cycle. Within monitoring and evaluation, you're thinking about monitoring the day-to-day activities, evaluating the impact of those day-to-day activities. And you do that in different ways. Like I said, if you're with a larger organization, then you're going to be following kind of the frameworks that the organization has set forth in terms of how the organization is prioritizing according to their mission, what their impact is going to be, and you're lining up your program objectives with kind of those indicators and identified outcomes. Or if you're more of a smaller organization, your M&E activities might be building out your theory of change, right? Which is kind of a logic model to think through kind of what are the large societal goals that you're contributing to, and then what are the objectives that your program is looking to achieve that's achievable within the time and resources. And then kind of moving backwards, what are your outcomes that you would like to achieve? And then your outputs are kind of like what's going to lead into your outcomes, and you build your activities from there, right? And so it's in the day-to-day, there can be a lot of different activities, from a needs assessment, if you're working with a team, to monitoring and collecting data, to analyzing data, to then sharing the data with your program teams and communities, to then learning the data. So that's a quick summary.
One of the things that strikes me about what you're saying, and I think a lot of people who are on the program end are not cognizant of the fact that this needs to be done simultaneously, that we think about, okay, here's my program, then we'll evaluate it. But what you're suggesting is the program development and the notion that there's going to be an evaluation has to be done simultaneously, because there may be things that are developed in a program that may be very difficult to evaluate. So does that mean that there's a different way of doing it in order to achieve an evaluation, if that makes sense, right? And the other thing, go ahead, tell me, what are you thinking? Yeah.
Oh, sorry, David. I was gonna kind of differentiate between formal evaluations, because I think that formal evaluation of a program is going to take a lot of resources. So absolutely thinking about, if you're going to do a formal evaluation, what are those key questions that you want to be thinking about in the very beginning, so that you put in place the resources and you put in place the data collection processes to gather the data to answer those key questions that are aligned with your, high level objectives. Sorry, go ahead though.
Thanks.
No, and the other thing that it always remind me of is you always want to remember, and students have to understand, is that it's about quantitative and qualitative analysis, right? There are numbers and there are things that are not numerical that we want to collect also, and the challenges of trying to get them both right, kind of a thing. And that's all part of the process, right? I mean, you're going to interview people at the same time you're going to measure how they're feeling about things or whatever it may be.
Right. Yeah. I don't know if it's useful to offer an example, but at some point I can, to thread the conversation through. I mean, an example with a project in terms of a project that I worked with, the Daraja Academy, serving high school students in Kenya from across the world. And I did this through my dissertation work, and then afterwards supporting the school called Daraja Academy. And one of their projects, called Women of Integrity, Strength, and Hope, is a curricular life skills project that they developed with the community out of the needs from the community, right? And so, the objective being, one of the objectives being an enhanced self-efficacy or agency among the girls through leadership, let's say. And so if that's kind of the objective, then you think about the outcomes that you'd like to do is, a percentage of the students are participating in these classes, and then the outputs might be the curriculum that you're developing and the teacher training that you're doing. And then you think back into the activities being the classes that you're providing and thinking through those activities in the day-to-day. And the inputs would be the resources needed and the funding and the teachers, right? And so that's an example of thinking through a project design and kind of thinking about it in the lens of this logic model of a theory of change. So that's maybe a kind of a concrete example.
It's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah. Back to what David just mentioned too, we hear a lot about evidence-based practice and evidence-based work. And I think it is important for us always to remember, because I think there's a reliance on that quantitative data, right? On the numbers and the significance, and sort of here's all these things. Remembering too that really it's that talking with people, it's that qualitative work, it's that interviewing that gives you the whys and the hows from the voice of your participants, right? So you may have a great idea as to why something may be happening, but you actually end up speaking with people and find out, oh, that's not the thing that I thought was fueling this, it's something else. And so, I know in different fields, and some students may be coming into this with different ideas of what evidence-based practice is, and really thinking about how we can holistically look at all of our types of evidence. So I'm sort of glad to, that sort of emphasis on voice and emphasis on from the community and their perspective and their needs, because sometimes we come from different angles, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and monitoring and evaluating, you can think of monitoring as kind of like monitoring the activities, the day-to-day. So back to that example, monitoring that the classes are happening, monitoring and taking the data on the rate of participation. So the attendance, number of students, things like that. Evaluating would be more kind of evaluating whether you're reaching those objectives by looking at those questions and asking those qualitative questions through interviews, and then looking at data, the quantitative, and then the evidence-based practice, like the evidence that can be implemented in the design phase through it could be research evidence demonstrating from other programs what the research evidence says to be effective interventions, or it could be practitioner knowledge that's from other similar project models. But a lot of times when you hear evidence-based practice, what people might be referring to is that research evidence, but there's that's contested too. What is evidence? Who says
Right.
that knowledge is valid to be used as evidence. But that's a lot of times where you see it implemented is through that the design.
Yeah,
from
great.
research.
So maybe coming off of that, so thinking about, because in your explanation of the program a cycle and all these activities, you've named about, I don't know how many skill sets, right? Like, and I think that's something for our viewers to really think about, that if you're thinking about what skill sets do I bring and where I get them from and sort of how I develop them, there's a range there. So I guess I would ask you, what preparation, so there may be students watching, there may be young professionals watching, there may be those who are mid-career but looking to get additional skills or backgrounds or things like this. So what kind of preparation would you recommend to our viewers who maybe want to enter into the M&E field, things like classes, outside training, things they need to be looking for in terms of professional development? What are some of those ideas that you may have?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in terms of thinking again through the program cycle, in terms of preparation and working with the community, the skill sets around conducting and designing a needs assessment, doing a stakeholder analysis, listening, right? We're listening to the community. We're assessing. So if we think of that as listening skills and community-based practices and participatory research practices, those might be some classes, research methods that are more participatory based, classes might be, or community-based practices, might be some interesting certificates or courses. And then there's that, again, moving from the preparation to the design phase and thinking about monitoring and evaluation certificates. There's a lot out there to learn how to do monitoring and evaluation. And again, if you align this with research skills, then that is just qualitative research skills. So conducting focus groups, individual interviews, doing key informant interviews, things like that. So what are those research skills that you need as a qualitative researcher? And then what are the research skills that you might need as a quantitative researcher? So maybe statistics classes, not to scare you away, right? But just
Right.
Data visualization, being able to communicate these impacts and findings to someone who doesn't think about statistics every day. And so making sure it's accessible, because you don't want to just share the findings from a project with the donor or with your coworker. You want to share that with the community. So data visualization, being able to translate that to the community, with the community. Project management skills. So that implementation phase, project managing all of your timelines and things like that is really useful. And then, thinking about the end of cycle might be the transfer skills. So learning the lessons and reflecting. So what does that look like in terms of feeding those lessons learned back into the project cycle? But I would also say just, a lot of this work in the nonprofit world is donor driven. And so how do you read a request for proposal? And how do you look for the type of monitoring and evaluation frameworks within a proposals, and what kind of indicators of success are they looking for? And so that would also be a good skill set. So I think, when I took my master's, this M&E classes weren't necessarily the norm. And certainly when I started my degree, this wasn't the norm, but we were still, in my early time with the Peace Corps, we were still looking at impact, but we weren't taking the time necessarily to design these processes and report them out as formally. But I think now people are realizing this is really important, and it has to do with learning and do no harm, right? Like we need to make sure that we're using evidence that's existing out there, so we're not reinventing the wheel, that we're learning from what we're doing, that we're conducting this with communities, and that we're not harming any communities through these project or program interventions.
One of the areas you mentioned that I see a big growth in is project management skills. It's amazing how many professionals in, we'll say, the peace building humanitarian field are getting project management professional certification, PMP. It's becoming more popular to kind of get that background, because what you're saying is that kind of being able to manage the stove, so to speak, right? Prioritize and know what you need to do before something else is really important when you're doing things that are, so critical of the collecting evidence and data and so forth, and getting this all together in a way that the other thing you say is that, well, and that's kind of the elephant in the room, is that, well, who cares about this? Well, who cares about this is our donors, right? They care about this and they're interested in how this works and so forth. So how do you get it together so that you can give it to them in a way that makes sense to them and what they need, right? Which may be less sophisticated. One of the things I think is always a challenge is making sure that what we do is understandable to people who don't do what we do, right?
Yeah.
That translation skill, I imagine, is something you have to do a lot of.
Yeah. And I think so, to make this approachable, if it's okay, I was thinking through like more language that's a little more approachable. And so if you think of the program design and you think of community, so this is accessible to anyone. Anyone can do monitoring and evaluation. Anyone can do program design. Think about your preparation as you're listening with community. So listening, okay? So listening with you're observing and you're working with community. And then you think of the design as creating with community. So what are you creating? We all know and can see the needs. So how are you creating with community? And then the implementation phase can be considered as being with. So how do you be with community in these opportunities of new resources? And then kind of moving that cycle through, how do you exchange and sustain together? So whatever it is that you're trying to do in your interventions, how are you sustaining those long term? And then exchanging the knowledge or whatever it is, resources, long term for sustainability. And then we learn and reflect. So if we think about it, it's not as hard as some of these frameworks that are put out there. And so it is accessible.
And it's a very elicitive model that you're describing, right? It's very letter act like, right? You're listening from the people you're working with, right? I mean, the of us who are in the peace studies field, we know the importance of that kind of elicitive model that letter act puts out there, and that we don't create it, we co-create it with people. We work with the people we're working with to develop it. Becomes important.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm actually glad that you mentioned data visualization, because I can't count the number of colleagues that I have that very recently have gone to webinars and trainings about this and thinking, gosh, we've been doing this for 15 years and I had no idea not to use this kind of graph or not to use this sort of thing. And there are so many tools now out there, like back in the Stone Age when, there was very little computer, maybe your Excel sheet with the graph, like that was incredible, and now there's so many tools and way of framing things. It can almost, I think, be overwhelming. I think when I see my students, they're almost overwhelmed by their options in terms of what they can use and what programs and how things should look, and should it look like, if you're trying to design something for a donor or community presentations or all of those sorts of things, there's a lot of pressure to sort of make it look like graphic design and things like this, when actually there's some really interesting ways of thinking about, if you as a community member yourself, how do you like to get information? How do you like to see it? What's that sort of thing? And that translational skill, as David said, is sort of so important, because I think sometimes we get into our heads, all of our statistical models and things like that, that sort of we forget that there, that's really only meaningful within sort of a small group of people, and it's our job and responsibility to sort of make it mean, like to express that meaning, and then to also get feedback back on what meaning we think it has, and is it something that, is sustainable longer term, or, are there other ways of making it more meaningful, right?
Yeah.
So I'm glad you kind of brought that up, because a data visualization has been on my mind. So I think then that kind of weaves us into the last main question that we have, which we've kind of been talking about throughout this, is what are the current trends you're seeing now, or what are the trends that our young professionals, our students, even those who are going back and thinking about mid or second careers, what's being asked for now? What are some of the major topic areas? What are some issues that people need to be thinking about, or maybe rethinking about? I know we've already talked about a climate, so that they can focus on this within the sort of larger humanitarian world. Like what are the trends in M&E, and what are the trends in maybe some of the issues that we need to think about how we do monitor and evaluate and create these projects?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think we've touched on a few, but maybe if just a few to note would be ensuring these all kind of intertwine, but I would say localization processes, working with, right? Decolonial lens to this work as well. And so what does that mean in terms of what you were saying, the ways in which we are knowledge brokers, and what does knowledge mean, and how are we translating our learnings with and for the community, right, into ways of knowing that is recognizable and contextual, right, and culturally appropriate for that context. And then that feeds into kind of this DEI lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think localization, decolonization, and DEI might be a few of the trends, and I might be biased in that. So I didn't do any research to look at what the trends are, but through the work that I've done and the organizations I've worked with, those are definitely conversations. And so what that translates to, again, is participatory and community-based practices. So conducting, the ways in which we're conducting interviews, the ways in which we're compensating for people's time for those interviews, the ways in which we are designing our surveys with community, including community, including youth, in participatory ways, to say what research questions should we be asking. So that might be participatory action research or youth participatory action research methodologies. And so just thinking about ideas of inclusion throughout these processes, I think is one question that we should continue to ask, who's at the table, who's missing from the table as we're preparing these programs and the design, and continually asking those questions. And I think the bigger picture, and sort of my advocacy plug here, would be donor education around those things, right? Around decolonizing, around participatory based practices, and around the need for inclusion, because inclusion takes time. And our timelines with donor driven, restrictive 3-year program cycles doesn't always include time to build those relationships with communities, to listen effectively and be with and engage with and reflect with, right? And so I think that we're getting there, and I think organizations are really focused on these participatory based practices, but the funding sources need to also support and prioritize that.
That idea of the time that it takes to nurture a community and to develop a project, this idea that we would parachute in and parachute out, kind of the way it was in the early days, right? And nothing was accomplished except expectations were set by communities that something would be done and nothing would be done. And we often left it in worse shape than we got there because we were just disruptive more than anything else, right? This idea of staying a long time. I remember talking about Lederach. He went to Nepal. He was there for 10 years, right? And John Paul Lederach said, if I'm going to go to Nepal, I'm going to do it for 10 years. And so this idea of staying to make the change and seeing it through is so very important in this work. And the funders are driving this. You're right. If the funders say, well, you need to report in 6 months and there's another grant cycle and you've got to be done. Well, you got to be done, right? How do you change that?
And maybe that's bringing the funders and donors into the room, right? And having them participate in this process. And so there's key stakeholder as much as the community. If we are committed to real change for all of us, since I believe we're all interconnected, then the donors and the community members should all be participating in these processes. So we're all asking important questions that are relevant and contextually and culturally appropriate.
Absolutely. That point, I think, is something really to drive home, that it's up to us to also communicate with those donors and to stress this. And, it's, the donors are a stakeholder and they have the funding, but there's also deep interest and I would say with most of them, sort of, a willingness to want to see this change, but potentially not fully understanding why something can't be implemented in, if it's just this, then why isn't 3 years enough, right? And really thinking about how we communicate, how we work with the community and work with our donors to communicate everyone's stakeholder needs within this, so that, we do get these projects that, as David said, don't represent a kind of that older model of in and out and, did the project work or not, or, but instead, how does the project even change as it's being implemented, and what are things we didn't think about, and sort of all of that, and where that flexibility can come from, and how the donors can support that as a demonstration of their commitment. So those are interesting conversations, right? So also thinking about how students or young professionals prepare themselves for thinking about how to include the donor perspective in their work, and how they can have those conversations is an important skill set.
Yeah. One of the things to remember is that you can say no to the money. And I think that's hard for people seeking money to say no, right? If the restrictions are such and the expectations are such that the project isn't going to be the project it should be, do we have the ability to say no at times? And it's hard to say no, right? We have to do that, right?
And question, impact. So I believe in the power of one, right? And so sometimes, the education around this is that it's not just impact in numbers, but there are beautiful programs that do take funding that have an impact on a small group of people, and then they take that and they build it out, right? And so I think that there's a lot of advocacy for centering the needs within communities that this, project design is happening, and really focusing on supporting those community needs, whether or not it takes time or it's through narrative storytelling and sharing out this knowledge and getting the knowledge out. There's a lot of different program and project models to learn from. And so, yeah, lot of ways of doing this work. So for students interested, there's a lot of entree points.
I also wanted to circle back what you just said, right? That listening as a skill, and we in the field attend hard technical skills and soft social skills, and that is not a dichotomy. I mean, they all feed into one another, right? Like you can have the technical skills, you can know the thing and how to work the piece of equipment or how to do, but you're doing it within a social context. And that sometimes I know that in certain areas of our practice or the humanitarian world, there's such an emphasis on, how I use the equipment or how I do the thing, or how, the tactics and operation. And I know in our exercises, we spend a lot of time thinking about the social context and what questions did you ask? Did you get full information? Did you walk away thinking you knew what was going on, but didn't actually confirm it or ask, or how did you get that information? And it's soft skills or social skills. Again, that word soft skills drives me nuts, but those social skills are in the end oftentimes what may make or break a project. And so having that is not an option. And so really thinking just how we listen and how we understand narrative and, all of those sorts of things, like those are not things to shy away from. Those are things to actually continually practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
David, was there anything else you wanted?
Oh, this has been great. I have nothing else to add. I picked up some really great insights. I can share with my students, and
Lots of notes.
sharing the interview with my students. So thank you.
Yeah.
I won't show you my notes that I have a big notes page too in preparation for this.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate you bringing your expertise into our Zoom box, and your background and your knowledge set. And I've learned a lot here, and I think that our viewers will too. And it really does help to sort of hear that there are many ways of thinking about what humanitarian and peace building practice is and how it's done, and how you can be a part of it. So I really appreciate you taking your time out this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah.
Kate.
Great.
Absolutely. And I would just say to the students that they should check out and look up people and ask for informational interviews, because I think if they find something they're interested in and they find someone doing that work, that's just making those connections is always useful. And then welcome to the field if you're not already in it.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I think with that, I'm going to end the recording. So thanks everyone for watching.